There's a quiet paradox in human psychology that most of us don't notice at first. The people who understand the least are often the most certain, not because they've examined more, but because they've examined less. Awareness doesn't arrive all at once. It grows through friction, being challenged, being wrong, sitting with discomfort long enough to learn from it. Without those moments, the mind fills in the gaps with confidence. Certainty becomes a substitute for understanding. This is what creates the invisible gap, a space between what someone knows and what they think they know. And the smaller that space is perceived to be, the harder it becomes to see beyond it. From the inside, everything feels complete, coherent, obvious. There's no signal that something is missing. What makes this gap so difficult is that it isn't stupidity or lack of intelligence. It's a natural feature of the mind. The brain is wired to protect a stable sense of self. Admitting uncertainty feels like a threat, so instead, the mind chooses clarity, even if that clarity is false. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Every one of us starts here. Growth doesn't begin with seeing more of the world. It begins with realizing how much we haven't seen yet. That realization is rare, and it's where real awareness quietly begins. Confidence is often mistaken for clarity. We tend to assume that the person who speaks the loudest, interrupts the least, or hesitates the least must know what they're talking about. But psychologically, certainty and understanding are not the same thing. When the mind lacks depth, it compensates with firmness. This isn't arrogance in the dramatic sense, it's protection. Uncertainty creates anxiety. It forces a person to confront limits, gaps, and the possibility of being wrong. For a fragile sense of self, that feels destabilizing. So instead of exploring further, the mind settles quickly. It chooses an answer and holds onto it tightly. This is how confidence becomes an illusion, not built on insight, but on the need to feel grounded. The less someone questions their assumptions, the more solid those assumptions feel. Doubt is experienced not as curiosity, but as danger. What's important to understand is that this process is largely unconscious. People don't decide to be overconfident. Their nervous system does it for them. Certainty calms the system. It restores a sense of control. And once that relief is felt, the mind learns to repeat the pattern. Over time, this creates a closed loop. New information isn't evaluated, it's filtered. Anything that aligns with existing beliefs is welcomed. Anything that challenges them is dismissed, argued against, or reframed as irrelevant. Not because it's wrong, but because it threatens stability. True understanding, by contrast, is quieter. It leaves room for hesitation. It can tolerate not knowing, and that's why it often looks less confident from the outside, even though it sees far more. Stubbornness is often mistaken for strength. From the outside, it can look like conviction, someone who stands their ground, doesn't waver, doesn't bend. But psychologically, rigidity rarely comes from confidence. It comes from fear. To be flexible, a person needs an inner sense of safety. They need to believe that being wrong won't erase their worth. Without that safety, even small challenges feel dangerous. A differing opinion isn't just another perspective, it becomes a threat to identity. This is where stubbornness is born. Not as a conscious choice, but as a protective reflex. If I don't bend, I can't break. If I don't question myself, I don't have to face the possibility that something inside me is incomplete. Inside a rigid mind, there's often a quiet equation running in the background. If I'm wrong, I lose. If I lose, I matter less. So the person holds their position tighter and tighter, not because it's true, but because letting go feels unbearable. What makes this pattern difficult to spot is that it can coexist with intelligence. Someone can be sharp, articulate, even knowledgeable, and still deeply rigid. Rigidity isn't about intellect, it's about emotional tolerance. the tolerance for uncertainty, for ambiguity, for the discomfort of self-correction. True strength looks very different. It shows up as the ability to pause, to listen without immediately defending, to revise an opinion without collapsing. Flexibility requires more internal stability than stubbornness ever will. And until that stability develops, rigidity will continue to masquerade as strength, convincing the person holding it that they are standing tall, when in reality, they are holding themselves together. When someone lives in constant defense mode, everyday interactions stop feeling neutral. A question sounds like an accusation. A suggestion feels like criticism. Even silence can be interpreted as judgment. To the outside world, their reactions may seem exaggerated or unnecessary, but inside their nervous system, something very different is happening. Defense mode isn't a personality trait, it's a state. It develops when a person has learned, consciously or not, that being relaxed isn't safe. Their mind stays alert, scanning for threats that others don't even notice. And when the body is in that state, it doesn't wait for certainty. It reacts first. This is why everything feels like a fight. The moment someone speaks, the system asks, am I being challenged? Am I being diminished? Am I about to lose ground? And if the answer feels even slightly like yes, the response is immediate. Tension, irritation, sharpness, withdrawal, or anger. What's important to understand is that this isn't about the content of the conversation. It's about identity. When a person's sense of self feels fragile, disagreement doesn't stay on the level of ideas. It becomes personal. A differing opinion isn't just different, it feels like an attempt to place them below someone else. Over time, this state reshapes perception. The world begins to look hostile, even when it isn't. Conversations become battles to survive, rather than exchanges to understand. And the person living this way often feels exhausted without knowing why. From the outside, others may think, why is everything so intense with them? From the inside, it feels like vigilance is the only way to stay intact. Until someone learns that their worth doesn't depend on winning, defending will keep replacing listening, and connection will keep feeling like conflict. For some people, disagreement isn't just something that happens in conversation, it is the conversation. The moment an idea is presented, the reflex to push back appears almost instantly. Not after reflection, not after understanding, just a quick, automatic resistance. This isn't about loving debate or valuing critical thinking, it's something deeper and far less conscious. Arguing becomes a way to assert existence, a way to signal, I'm not beneath you, I'm not losing ground. When disagreement turns into an identity, being right stops being the goal. The goal becomes not being wrong, because in their internal world, wrongness carries weight. It implies inferiority, weakness, or loss of status. So the mind reacts before the information is even processed. That's why these arguments often feel disorienting. You can be discussing values, and suddenly the conversation shifts to tactics. You can be sharing an insight, and they respond with a technicality. The content doesn't matter as much as the position. As long as they're opposing, they feel safe. And here's the exhausting part for everyone else. Engagement reinforces the pattern. When you explain, clarify, or defend your point, the other person feels validated in arguing. Your effort becomes proof in their mind that they've won something. When you finally stop responding, they interpret silence as defeat, but nothing was actually resolved. No understanding was built. What looked like confidence was really anxiety in disguise, an urgent need to protect the self from feeling smaller. This is why logic alone never works here. You're not debating ideas, you're stepping into someone's defense system. And defense systems don't listen. They react. Real dialogue requires the ability to stay intact without opposing. Until that capacity exists, disagreement will keep being used not to discover truth, but to hold the self together. One of the most subtle and most destructive patterns in low awareness is emotional reasoning. It happens when feelings are treated not as internal signals, but as objective evidence. I feel attacked, therefore I am being attacked. I feel disrespected, therefore you disrespected me. In this state, emotion doesn't inform perception, it replaces it. Psychologically, this occurs when a person hasn't developed enough distance from their inner experience. There's no observer mode, no pause between what is felt and what is concluded. The emotion arrives and the story forms instantly around it. This is why conversations escalate so quickly. A neutral comment triggers discomfort. That discomfort is interpreted as meaning, and meaning becomes accusation. The person isn't choosing to overreact, they genuinely experience their feelings as facts about the world. What's missing isn't emotional intensity, it's emotional literacy, the ability to say, I'm feeling something strong, let me understand it before I act on it. Without that skill, feelings run the system. And when emotions drive conclusions, reasoning becomes impossible. Any attempt to clarify sounds like denial. Any explanation feels invalidating. From the inside, it seems obvious. How could you argue with what I feel? But feelings, while real, are not always accurate. They reflect internal states shaped by past experiences, fears, and expectations. Without awareness, those internal states get projected outward, and others are blamed for what was never caused by them. This pattern creates constant conflict and deep confusion, not because people are cruel, but because they mistake emotional reactions for truth. Awareness begins when someone learns to feel deeply, without immediately believing the story their emotions are telling them. Kindness is often described as a universal good, something that heals, softens, and brings people closer together. But there's a truth that rarely gets spoken. Kindness is only understood by those who have the awareness to recognize it. For someone with limited self-reflection, kindness doesn't register as generosity, it registers as leverage. When a person lacks the ability to examine their own motives, they also struggle to imagine clean motives in others. So when you show patience, empathy, or restraint, it isn't experienced as care. It's interpreted through a power lens. You're being kind because you're afraid. You're holding back because you're weaker. This misreading creates a quiet but dangerous shift. The other person begins to feel elevated, not through achievement, but through contrast. Your boundaries blur. Their confidence grows not from insight, but from misinterpretation. And what began as goodwill slowly turns into entitlement. This is the shadow side of unbounded kindness. Not everyone becomes softened by being treated well. Some people become emboldened, especially those who already measure relationships in terms of dominance and control. This doesn't mean kindness is a mistake. It means kindness requires discernment. It needs boundaries to remain healthy. Without them, it can activate the worst instincts in people who aren't capable of mutual respect. True kindness isn't self-erasing. It doesn't shrink to be accepted, and it isn't proven by how much you tolerate. It's expressed through clarity, limits, and self-respect. Compassion without awareness doesn't create connection. It creates imbalance. One of the most painful realizations in psychological growth is this: not everyone is capable of understanding you, no matter how clearly you explain yourself. This isn't because you fail to communicate, it's because understanding doesn't come from words alone, it comes from internal capacity. People don't just hold different opinions, they inhabit different internal worlds. Their level of awareness shapes what they can perceive, tolerate, and make sense of. Two people can hear the same sentence and experience entirely different meanings because they're not standing on the same psychological ground. This is why some conversations go in circles. You clarify your intention, and it's still misread. You soften your tone, and it's still felt as an attack. From your perspective, it's confusing. From theirs, it's consistent with how their world works. Understanding requires reflection, the ability to step outside oneself and ask, could there be another interpretation? Without that skill, everything is filtered through personal defenses, emotional reasoning, and past experiences. No amount of explanation can bridge that gap. This isn't about intelligence, education, or social status. Some of the most accomplished people remain deeply limited in how they understand others. And some of the most grounded individuals live quietly, with little external recognition. When levels differ, frustration is inevitable, unless you stop expecting mutual comprehension. Clarity doesn't always lead to connection. Sometimes it leads to acceptance of limits. Not everyone is meant to understand you, and realizing that isn't giving up. It's choosing peace over endless correction. There's a simple question that quietly reveals whether someone has grown in awareness. It isn't about success, knowledge, or how confident they sound. It's this: when you look at who you were years ago, how do you feel? If the answer is, I was already right back then, growth is unlikely. But if there's a moment of discomfort, an almost embarrassed recognition of past certainty, that's a sign of expansion. Because awareness doesn't flatter the past, it recontextualizes it. Maturity isn't the absence of mistakes, it's the ability to see them without collapsing. When someone can look back and say, I didn't know what I didn't know, they've developed something essential: perspective. And perspective only comes from distance. This is why growth often feels humbling rather than empowering. Each new layer of understanding exposes how narrow the previous one was. Not in a self-punishing way, but in a clarifying one. The world didn't suddenly change. You just began to see more of it. People who haven't grown tend to protect their past selves fiercely. Admitting former blindness feels like admitting current weakness, so they freeze. Their identity becomes fixed at a certain stage, defended instead of revised. Real maturity, by contrast, stays fluid. It allows the self to be edited. It tolerates the truth that earlier versions of us were incomplete, not because we failed, but because we hadn't lived enough yet. If your past self sometimes makes you wince, that's not shame. That's evidence of movement. Awareness doesn't arrive as a finish line. There's no moment where you suddenly have it and stop growing. In fact, the deeper awareness becomes, the less urgent it feels to prove anything at all. The need to be right fades when the self no longer feels at risk. When your sense of worth isn't tied to winning arguments or correcting others, you can listen without tightening. You can disagree without defending. You can let misunderstanding exist without chasing it down. This doesn't mean disengaging from truth. It means releasing the belief that truth must always be enforced. Some people aren't ready to see what you see, not because they're incapable forever, but because awareness unfolds in stages, and stages can't be skipped. As awareness grows, something subtle but powerful shifts. You begin to choose clarity over control, peace over performance, boundaries over explanation. And with that choice, life becomes quieter, not emptier but steadier. If any part of this video helped you recognize a pattern, in others or in yourself, you're not alone. This channel exists to explore the quieter psychological dynamics that shape how we relate, react, and grow. If you found value here, consider subscribing for more reflections like this. And if you feel comfortable, leave a comment below. What was one moment in your life that changed how you see yourself or others? That's where real awareness continues to deepen.